Doctor Who has been entertaining and terrifying children and their parents alike for the last 60 years now, whether that be intergalactic trash cans, primordial potato people, or female doctors. The show has had people of all ages cowering behind their sofas. Going off the last few horror films that I've seen recently, it looks like they can learn a thing or two from Doctor Who. So today, we're going to be taking a look at and breaking down what makes Doctor Who so scary. And how about we start, well, at the beginning, and that would be with the writing process. So let's take a look at an episode that you've probably seen but have selectively removed from your memory in order to sleep comfortably at night. And this episode is entitled The Empty Child. We join the Doctor and Rose, who are following a mysterious spaceship that ends up crash landing in the middle of blitz-torn London during World War II. But whilst investigating, things very quickly take a turn for the unusual. And man, this era of Doctor Who really had it all. Great writing, a great, good old British sense of humour.
You sure about that t-shirt?
Too early to say. I'm taking it out for a spin.
Okay, maybe not this t-shirt.
Action, intrigue, romance, and, as we're about to get into, horror. This episode revolves around a young boy in a gas mask who I imagine was the result of many a sleepless night for British kids in the 2000s. Now at first this episode simply plays into the idea that children can be creepy. By the 2000s, this wasn't a particularly revolutionary concept, but one thing that Doctor Who does with the utmost proficiency is building atmosphere. And that is what it begins to do. And it starts, surprisingly, with comedy. Unlike a lot of modern Marvel productions, this episode, like many others, perfectly balances the humour with the darker themes in the episode.
I want to find a blonde in a Union Jack. I mean a specific one. I didn't just wake up this morning with a craving. Anybody seen a girl like that?
But the humour's not just there for the sake of a few laughs. It serves a purpose. The Doctor's jovial demeanour, in the face of something that would have most viewers running for the hills or clutching the nearest blunt object, that's the first trap that the writers lay for the audience.
Never easy being the only child left out in the cold, you know.
I suppose you'd know.
I do, actually, yes.
After all, if the Doctor isn't worried, there's nothing to worry about. He knows what he's doing, but the writers know this, that you, the audience, take comfort in the Doctor's humorous optimism. And the writers can then cleverly begin to use this against you. They've established the Doctor as this all-knowing, happy-go-lucky safe haven for the viewers. But if that safe haven burns down, if the Doctor is placed into a position of uncertainty, or if he's made to feel fearful, you, the audience, will experience that emotion with him. Your sense of security will shatter along with the Doctor's. It's such a novel concept, using comedy as a building block for horror. Who would think to do that? Doctor Who would think to do that. Talking of comedy, it's simple writing techniques executed well. It's like handing Stevie Ray Vaughan a $20 charity store guitar. It's a cheap guitar, but best believe he's going to shred it. It's not what you play, it's how you play it. And just because a technique might be basic doesn't mean it can't be incredibly effective. There are a few jumpy moments throughout the episode, but it never feels cheap. The fear factor is subtle and psychological. You're not sat there screaming, but you feel an intense sense of discomfort throughout the episode. And it's brilliant. The Doctor is then directed to a nearby hospital by the girl that he met earlier on in the episode, where he meets a doctor. But this one's an actual doctor, who's been watching over and attempting to study a number of bodies, all of which have suffered from the same unknown affliction.
Conclusions?
Massive head trauma, mostly to the left side. Partial collapse of the chest cavity, mostly to the right. There's some scarring on the back of the hand, and the gas mask seems to be fused to the flesh, but I can't see any burns.
And this is where the writers have a hook in the audience, and they begin to twist. The all-knowing suddenly isn't. The Doctor is not only directly challenged, but he's dumbfounded by the situation.
Physical injuries as plague. Can you explain that?
The Doctor has begun to recognise the magnitude of the problem, and his sense of control has begun slipping, and all of a sudden that very sturdy foundation that the writers had laid for the audience is slowly starting to crumble along with the Doctor's confidence, and this is the perfect time to crank up the horror.
What was the cause of death?
There wasn't one. They're not dead.
Also, don't know if you caught it, and I don't know if it is intentional, but when Dr. Constantine drops the bombshell that the bodies aren't dead, we hear a literal bombshell going off in the background as the air raid is still ongoing.
What was the cause of death?
There wasn't one.
Nice touch if that was intentional, but it could very well just be a coincidence. But one thing that is not coincidental is a nice bit of writing. After all of the garbage I've been consuming over the last however many months, as I'm sure most of you are aware, it's nice to just hear a good bit of dialogue.
You're the only one here.
Before this war began, I was a father and a grandfather. Now I'm neither, but I'm still a doctor.
And yes, that is Richard Wilson, who played Gaius, for any of you who watched the BBC series of Merlin. Absolutely loved that series myself. I might have to even do a video on that at some point. And what's horror without a few plot twists? Whether it be Dr. Constantine becoming one of the empty gas-masked figures, or the fact that we learn that the boy in the gas mask from earlier was the girl's little brother all along. That point becomes even more disturbing when you consider the fact that this poor girl is being chased by the body of a little brother who's constantly calling out for its mother, and all she can do is run away from it. That is, that's pretty chilling. That's pretty cold, man. Now, this episode is a two-parter, and there are a whole bunch of twists leading to a very satisfying ending in part 2, but I'm here to break down the horror, not the entire plot, so I won't spoil that, and if you want to go back and watch it, go and check out Season 1, Episode 9 and 10. Next up, we're going to take a look at the concept of premise. Now, I have no evidence to back this up, but I'm almost certain that Doctor Who was a big influence on shows like Black Mirror. I mean, come on, if you replaced the Doctor and the Assistant every episode rather than, every few seasons, you've basically got another 13 seasons of Black Mirror. Okay, not quite, but you catch my drift. Each episode being its own self-contained story is not exclusive to either of these shows, but it is one of the elements that makes both of these shows so successful. There are overarching plot lines that permeate through the seasons of Doctor Who, but anyone could begin watching any episode, pretty much, and have a good time with it. Doctor Who's originality when it comes to each individual episode is outstanding. The quality control from Christopher Eccleston through to Matt Smith when it comes to premise is fantastic. Nothing is scarier than reality. You would rightly associate Doctor Who with aliens, although its fear factor comes from the most believable elements of the show and not always the most extraterrestrial. The most exciting, the most alluring, and in terms of this video, the scariest aspect of Doctor Who's premise is the Doctor's assistant. Why do you think the Doctor always has an assistant? And why do you think that assistant always happens to be a very regular, everyday person? That assistant is you, the viewer. That assistant acts as a gateway between you and the world of Doctor Who. Whether you're conscious of it or not, you'll find it much easier to sympathise or empathise with those who are similar to you. And in a world full of aliens, all of a sudden, that girl from London doesn't seem so different. And when you can sympathise with a character or empathise, you can imagine yourself in their shoes. And if you're emotionally intelligent enough, you don't even have to like that character. But the fact that you can place yourself in their shoes means that whilst watching, you can suspend disbelief just long enough for the writers to get their claws into you and make you start to wonder, what if that was you? If you imagine that the Doctor is Virgil and that the assistant is Dante, it's basically Dante's Inferno in space. That aspect of the premise of Doctor Who is simplistic genius. Throw an everyday person with no superpowers, no knowledge of space, time travel, or aliens into a world of exactly that, and the audience will learn alongside the assistant, they'll overcome adversity alongside the assistant, and they'll fear alongside the assistant as well. Now that's a part of the general premise of Doctor Who as a whole, so let's get a little bit more specific and talk about the premise behind a singular episode. And we're going to be looking at Season 3, Episode 3, titled Gridlock. And this is a scary episode, but not in a conventional way. There is an Irish catman. I could see why some might be terrified by such a prospect. But jokes aside, it is undoubtedly an unnerving episode. The Doctor and Martha land in New York, the 15th iteration of the original New York, a futuristic yet dystopian metropolis situated 50,000 light years from Earth on a planet now known as New Earth. Martha is immediately kidnapped, typical New York, and the Doctor and Martha then individually learn about the true nature of the city, or rather, the motorway, a road stacked full of hover vans stuck in a seemingly endless gridlock. Martha learns that her kidnappers have a 6-year journey ahead of them in order to travel 10 miles to get to their destination, and the Doctor's new friends have already been travelling for 12 years in which they've only covered 6 miles. The makers of Doctor Who didn't limit themselves. They explored different facets of fear. Sure, big, ugly, scary aliens can be scary. Dark, dingy places can be scary. Sudden, creepy sounds can be scary. But this episode is a great example of something a little more nuanced. The dreaded aliens in this episode are intended to be the overt source of fear within this episode, sure, but the subtext is far scarier. Anxiety. the fear of entrapment, the fear of losing precious years in what could be a pointless endeavor. The fear of being imprisoned is very real for a lot of people. Prison is used as a punishment and as a means to remove dangerous people from society, but it's also used as a deterrent. And there's a reason it's been used by almost every single human civilization and is currently being used in every single country in the world, pretty much. That fear of being enclosed, your rights and your ability to make decisions taken away from you, time being robbed from you, that fear alone is enough to deter vast swathes of crime. I mean, sure, some people like being within the prison system, some people are built for it, but that's not true for the vast majority of people. And that vast majority of people just so happen to be the demographic for, well, pretty much every TV show. I mean, production houses ideally want as many people watching their shows as possible. But to that vast majority of people, prison is a very foreign concept. The only thing these people know about prison is what they've seen on TV or heard in the news. So how do you convey these themes and fears to the everyday person? Well, thank you very much for asking. With allegory, of course. Most people have a job, and most people have to, in one way or another, commute to said job. And anyone who's found themselves stuck in the morning rush hour knows that this is the everyday man's prison. You'll find yourself in a temporary limbo, stuck in a confined space between here and there. You might have a steering wheel, but it means very little under such circumstances. Your progress is subject to the mercy of a higher power, and should you manage against all odds to push through the bottleneck and arrive at your destination, who's to say that's really where you want to be? This is a masterful example of how you convey foreign themes to an audience. What a brilliant blend of time-honored human anxiety and the everyday plight of the masses. With a big bunch of ugly space crabs as well. I mean, this is Doctor Who after all. And with that, let's move on to the last point in this video, which is execution, but not the medieval kind, the creative sort. Formulating ideas is an important and intrinsic part of the creative process, but it's only half the story. The other half is how you implement that idea. An idea lives or dies, ironically, in its execution. An okay idea with great execution will almost always be better than a great idea with okay execution. Ask any gymnast. The landing is the most important part. You could stand there on the spot and do a 720 quintuple backflip. It doesn't matter how fancy it is, unless you stick the landing with great form and give it one of them. I mean, in terms of filmmaking, the arm gestures are not quite as important, but the principle is, goddammit. Take this next episode, for example, and this is probably one of the most infamously creepy episodes of Doctor Who, and it's called Don't Blink. Come on now, you didn't think I'd be talking about horror within this series without mentioning the Weeping Angels, did you? The writing in this episode is nothing short of f***ing fabulous. Great idea, but most importantly, great execution. The Weeping Angels are a species of alien that, when observed, turn to stone, but should they get their hands on you, they'll send you into the past and make you live to death. Very anime, very cool. But when it comes to time travel, things can get a little bit complicated, and this could have easily devolved into complete chaos. But it didn't.
But you didn't.
They stuck the landing. So the past is influencing the present by people who were in the present but sent back to the past, so the past is right in the present. And okay, even I'm getting confused at this point. The time loop in this episode could have easily spawned fallacy, and plot holes aplenty. But it was meticulously written, and they made sure to tie up each end. The angels in this episode, we never see them physically move. They are literally just pieces of stone. It could have easily crossed the boundary into silliness. They could have easily appeared comical or cheap, but they didn't.
But you didn't.
They had real presence. They carried weight on screen, and this is down to the execution. I know that might not sound like great praise, but in today's world of television, a show with great writing, great execution, and it makes sense, TV executives would laugh you out of the building these days. What, I mean, you want all three of those at the same time? Who are you, Jesus? And if, like myself, you watched this episode back when it first aired, you will almost certainly remember the fear you felt when you first saw the angel's eyes. But upon rewatching, I'd actually forgotten how emotional this episode was as well. It had me on the brink of tears at one point. Weeping angels, almost crying. There's a joke in there somewhere. Dude, Doctor Who used to be such a great show. British entertainment was, for the longest time, the antithesis, the opposite of modern, big-budget Hollywood. You know, British entertainment had the ability to do so much with so very little, and Doctor Who is a prime example of that practice. It was well written and thought through. It had action, costumes, sets, themes. It was never Hollywood levels of high production. It may have lacked that polish, but it more than made up for it with a sense of spirit and a raw desire to entertain. The reason I've used Doctor Who as an example for today's video is because at times it can be genuinely terrifying, but it contains none of the tired tropes found in a lot of horror. There's no gore, there's no excessive violence, it's not crammed full of obnoxious jump scares. Unfortunately, a lot of creatives who seek to make horror entertainment tend to lean on these tropes in order to carry a production. Now that definitely has its place, and there are people who enjoy that sort of thing, and hey, more power to you. But for me personally, it's a little clumsy. It lacks finesse. The last few horror films I've seen at the cinema, I've left feeling a little scared, sure, but dissatisfied more than anything else. Instead, Doctor Who used writing, premise, and execution in order to deliver a petrifying payload. That could of course be applied to any other genre, but rarely are those three things applied to horror. And that's why a lot of scary movies tend to be kinda shitty. Doctor Who is a family show, and when you take things like gore off the table, you've got to really work to make something scary. But if you do, that kind of scary can really work. Making something horrifying is one thing. Making something genuinely scary and family friendly, that's a whole nother challenge. But Doctor Who pulled it off with good writing, premise, and execution. Now, we only covered 3 episodes in today's video, but which did you think is the scariest Doctor Who episode you've seen? I'd be interested to know. And that, my friends, is why Doctor Who is, or was, a masterclass in horror. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. And as always, a big shout out to the patrons and the channel members. We have the top tiers. We have Flunky, Pozzabon, Infinite Dum Dum, Koss, Jax, David, ATS, Texas Lawman, Michael, Steve the Goat, David, Digital EXE, Dagger D69, incredibly nice, and of course, Michael Turpia. To each and every one of the top tiers, thank you ever so much for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. Tier 2s, we got Saeed, Dr. Melski, Yarnwich, Hadzu, Mendicant Bias, Sensei Fang, Mark Maidens, Canet Dogramachi, Saint Nemo, Michael S., Mad Karen Jarek, Rich Walwick, Nystagmus, and the Grand Admiral. Yes, thank you very much to each and every one of you as well. And of course, a big thank you to the tier 1s as well. To everyone on this list, thank you for sticking with me. Your support means the world to me, it really does. Thank you. And there we go, another day, another video. Will you join me for my next one? You better do. You little bitch. That's the most musical one so far. Take care of yourselves, guys. I'll see you real soon.